Welcome, Dr. Lisa Marchiano. I'm so happy to have you as our first guest on Down the Well. Thank you for being here. I basically started this whole YouTube channel to facilitate this conversation. So it's an elaborate scheme, I must admit.
You didn't have to work so hard. You just could have sent me an email.
Well, I was so privileged to interview you in 2023 over on Solly Baby's just Instagram account because I fell in love with your book, Motherhood, Finding and Facing Yourself. And it really has, it's not an overstatement to say that it's profoundly changed my life, the way that I mother, the way that I process motherhood. I've given away at least 30 copies at this point. And I know it's impacting so many other mothers as well. I mean, it comes all the way down to the literal inspiration for the title of the show, which is Down the Well. I'm excited to get into that as well. But first, I just want to give you a moment to introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about who you are and your background.
Yeah. Well, I'm a psychotherapist and specifically I'm a Jungian analyst. And for those of you who may not know what that means, I'm a psychoanalyst trained in the methods and theories of Carl Jung, who was a contemporary of Freud's. So kind of there at the birth of psychoanalysis, but he had very much his own ideas about the psyche and about the best way to live and grow. And if you've heard terms like introversion or synchronicity or collective unconscious or shadow or archetype, then you know a little bit about Jung. Those are all some of his ideas and some of his contributions. And so I became a Jungian analyst in 2011. I started training in 2003. My daughter was born in 2002, and my son was born in 2004. So I was becoming an analyst very much while I was mothering. And that is where this book came from. It grew out of my experience thinking about Jung, learning about Jung, integrating those ideas while I was also trying to figure out what it meant to be a mother.
Wow, that's amazing. I feel like oftentimes in motherhood, that is, it can spring up a kind of creativity or new birth, which is what we're going to talk about here today in unexpected ways. Can we start by talking about the idea of falling down the well? And how it relates to the mother's hero's journey, which I'm sure most people are not familiar with, but I am obsessed with.
Well, so there's this pattern that is evident in all kinds of places. It's evident in fairy tales. It's evident in initiation rituals. An anthropologist named Van Gennep noted this in his studies of initiation rituals probably about 100 years ago, that there's a kind of separation from everyday life. There is a kind of an existence in a liminal space, and then there's a return. And in fairy tales, especially fairy tales involving heroines, there's often a descent, a kind of spending time in a liminal space or a space sort of down there, and then there's the return. So this is an archetypal idea that there's this pattern, and it happens in our own lives, and it doesn't just happen once. It repeats and repeats and repeats. So in the book, I use this structure, basically kind of as a framing for the ideas. But the truth is that in being a mother, we're going to fall repeatedly. And I think about falling in the sense of losing your footing, not knowing what's going on, feeling like you're failing, maybe getting depressed. It's a descent.
I know that this closely relates to Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. Could you talk about, which maybe more people are familiar with, can you talk about the difference between the descent and the outward, the descent, the fall versus the outward?
Well, so Joseph Campbell, who was very much influenced by Jung, was a mythologist and has, just written some absolutely gorgeous books. One of the most famous ones is called The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and it is an incredible book. Everyone should read that book. And basically what he looks at is these themes that occur in all of these different hero tales. One of the classic examples of the hero's journey a la Joseph Campbell is Star Wars, which Campbell actually was a consultant on. So I'll use that one. But there's the call, and then there's the refusal of the call. So if you remember in Star Wars, Obi-Wan Kenobi says to Luke, come with me. And Luke says, I can't. I got to go help my aunt and uncle with the harvest. Right. So that's the call and the refusal of the call. And then Luke goes back and finds out, that everything has been, just wasted. It's looks like LA now. So he agrees to go with Obi-Wan Kenobi. Then there's the meeting of the helpful guide, that would be Obi-Wan Kenobi. And then there's the kind of the meeting with the dragon. And then there's all kinds of tests and tribulations. And then finally you come back out and you return to society with the boon that can help other people. So the hero tends to journey out. He goes out into the world. And there's a lot of discussion about whether the hero's journey applies to women too. And there's a wonderful book actually called The Heroine's Journey, which kind of answers that question, or attempts to answer that question. I don't know that there is a sort of a single easy answer to that, but I do think that many tales of female heroines involve a descent, like I was talking about before. So there's the fairy tale that I use as a kind of framing for this book. There is another very famous fairy tale called Motherhood, which is very similar. It's about a girl who gets kind of tossed down a well. And down at the bottom of the well, she becomes an apprentice to Motherhood, who is this kind of archetypal nature goddess figure. And then she returns. There's the story of Inanna and Ereshkigal, which is a very old tale from ancient Sumeria, where Inanna goes down. She makes a descent into kind of the Sumerian version of hell, spends some time down there with her sister Ereshkigal, and then is able to return. And when you return, you're different. You're changed. You're not the same person. So I think that one possible way of looking at it, and this is what I say in the book, is that the mother's hero's journey involves a descent. Perhaps women's hero's journeys, heroines' journeys, involve a descent, which maybe is less true for the hero.
If you were to compare it to what that journey looks like, maybe for a new mom, can you kind of walk us through that hero's journey, falling down the well, what that might look like, and how to make that return?
Well, again, I think that actually what happens is we make it again and again and again. So it isn't just one single cycle. We're just somewhere always on that cycle.
So fun.
And it, I know, isn't it? And it obviously depends very much. I'm so aware of this, on people's personal circumstances. So you may have a woman who's always known she wanted kids. She got pregnant fairly easily. It was, not a difficult pregnancy. She adapts well to the role of motherhood, and it's not a big deal. And maybe her sense of a descent is minimal, and she, it doesn't even really register. And there are some common themes maybe, but it can just be so individual. So I don't want anyone to feel, like if this isn't their experience, that somehow there's something wrong with them. But I'm thinking of a woman who maybe has always been very career focused. And maybe she feels very effective and competent at the office. And maybe she's really looking forward to being a mom. But then when the baby comes, she finds that she's really overwhelmed, or she's really bored, or she didn't like it as much as she thought she was going to. And there can be this huge loss. I think when I think about the descent, I think of a lot of losses. So it might be a loss of that beautiful ideal that she had of what it was going to be like to be a mother, or a loss of her sense as a kind of competent person, because if you're competent in an office, it doesn't mean you're going to know how to comfort a baby. So your whole sense of yourself can get shaken. And, this can become the basis or part of an experience of postpartum depression. It doesn't have to be. I think a lot of women can experience some version of this without it going to that degree, but it is it does shake one up. If you feel like, God, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be this baby's mother, or God, I really don't like this, or just get me back to the office. It's a terrible feeling. It can come with lots of shame. But if we're able to sort of be with that and meet it with some empathy for ourselves and some curiosity about it, and just some empathy for ourselves, we might be able to just appreciate what it's like to not have all the answers and not to always feel confident or competent, and recognize that it's an opportunity to meet a new part of ourselves that's flawed, but maybe wants to be known. And so if we can do that, if we can just sort of be a good companion to ourselves in the midst of that struggle, then it becomes, I want to say, transformative in a way, or it allows for a kind of shift. It may not mean that we still love being with an infant. It's not going to sort of change every aspect of it, but we can hold it differently. We can have a different relationship with it, and then we're just a little bit bigger.
Yeah, and trusting in that it is moving you to this new self that continues to develop, right? And I think that being able to trust that it is forward progress in a way is very helpful for me, at least, in framing these descents and these heroes' journeys that we, like you're saying, will continually go on, instead of kind of meaningless suffering.
Right. Yes. Right. Not the suffering ceases to be suffering when it has meaning. The other thing I want to say about the book and about the attitude that I'm holding as I talk about this is, it's not a book about how to be a better mother. It's a book about the mother's psychological experience and recognizing that the incredibly intense process of raising small humans changes us psychologically and is humbling and shows us our very worst parts of ourselves and our very best parts too. But we're going to know ourselves better as a result of it, and that's a pretty great thing. But it's not like, you just have to do this and then you'll be more psychologically evolved, and then you'll be a perfect mother who never gets angry at her kids. That's like not where I'm coming from. It's It's all about sort of being with yourself in your flaws.
Yeah, about that. Well, one of my favorite quotes from the book is where toward the beginning, you talk about sacrificing makes sacred. To sacrifice makes sacred, something along those lines. And my question is, how can we sacrifice without being self-sacrificing? I think a lot of women who are mothers right now saw their mothers in my phase of life, see their mothers maybe lose a lot more of their identity, their sexuality, just everything as they were raising their kids. And so there's this fear of sacrificing too much and losing ourselves. And I guess where is that line of sacrificing in a way that's going to deepen those connections, that it's going to deepen our understanding of ourselves without going too far, and also not going too far the other way either, because I think that being too afraid, that's going to create distance, right, between us and our experience in motherhood if we are afraid of the sacrifice that it requires.
Well, I think what you're putting your finger on, which is a really important thing, I think, when talking about mothering, is the difference between sacrifice and kind of martyrdom. One way to think about it is like, motherhood uses you up. You are going to have a diminution in certain ways. You're going to have less time for creative projects. You may lose your sexuality. You may lose your attractiveness. You may lose, career opportunities. You may lose friends. And it would be naive to say that, you can guard against any and all of those losses. But what I will say is that if we're lucky, life is going to use us up. That's kind of the point, that we should spend ourselves in the pursuit of something larger than self. Motherhood is not the only thing that you could spend yourself on, but it's a pretty good thing to spend yourself on. So I'm not, implying that we should just get ready for the tomb when we give birth, But to be realistic, that yes, there are going to be things that you give up, and the thing about kind of a conscious sacrifice is, and it does, the word sacrifice comes from the Latin, sacra facere, to make sacred, so that when we give something up, in service to something larger, it does become a sacred offering. So if we can have some consciousness around it. Then we're doing it kind of, with that attitude that we are in service to something larger. We're not just in service to our kids. I mean, we are, but that can also go too far, and then I'm thinking, then our kids are super entitled, What we're in service to is life. And that is, after all, what being a mother is about. Ultimately, is we're giving life and then we're nurturing life, and when we're caring for our kids, it's not that we're meeting every single demand that we have, but we are trying to shepherd them into life, and sometimes that means saying no or setting limits or whatever. So it's not that I'm going to always set my needs aside and always just think of you, dear child, and you'll get whatever you want, That's not the meaning of it. The meaning of it is, can we see ourselves in service to this larger principle of the life principle? And if we do that, then I don't think that we'll feel like we've martyred ourselves. We will have spent ourselves in service to something worthy. And that's a very different feeling than the resentment that comes with martyrdom. Because that's the other side of martyrdom, right? Is I resent you because I gave something up.
Right.
And you didn't have to, the woman who does that may resent her husband because, she did all the work and he didn't do any. Or she may resent her children, look at everything I did for you. And there's guilt involved, and in some sense, the paradox is a little bit that the way to avoid resentment is to live life as fully as possible. And it's true that being a mother in some ways means that you can't live life quite so fully, right? You can't just go off to Paris for a weekend unless you have extraordinary circumstances. But the thing is that having children is itself a very full thing to do. And so it can be part of living your life as fully as possible, sort of drinking life to the lees, as the poet said,
It's a beautiful distinction there. That's really helpful. And so you talk about the eternal girl. I think that is just a fascinating concept of the unwillingness really to sacrifice unlimited potential for a manifested reality. Is that right? But we need to do that to be able to mature. And I think it's something that many women struggle with. And especially, you say, if you didn't have a strong sense of self before becoming a mother. I know many women who went from their family home to a married home, nothing in between. And then they raise their children, it is quite the midlife crisis after going with who I actually don't know what I like. I don't know my own preference. I don't know myself. How does that kind of manifest itself throughout motherhood? And how can we conceptualize that as a positive, letting go of this girlhood, this eternal girl?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of the eternal girl, which is very much one of Jung's ideas, that was, developed by later thinkers too. But it's this idea of it's kind of, the male version of it. I would think of it as like a Peter Pan complex.
For eternus.
So, you don't want to grow up. You don't have to deal with the limitation that comes with sort of deciding, well, this is who I am and this is what I'm doing. And obviously there's a time of life when that is entirely appropriate. Like in in your 20s, maybe, if you're flitting about, trying different careers, being with different people, like that's great, right? But if you stay there, it doesn't work so well. If you stay there decade after decade, it's sort of like you have to pick something. Sometimes I think about this puella psychology, this kind of eternal girl psychology it's like you're in life's waiting room and there's all these different doors you could walk through, but you don't want to walk through any of the doors because once you walk through a door, you can't walk back out. So you don't have to pick. So you just want to stay in the waiting room, which is lovely, because you could walk through any door. But eventually the years have ticked by and you haven't walked through a door. And for the most part, I think that, having kids is really like walking through a door because you can't undo that. There's most of the decisions that you make, you can undo. You could get a divorce. You can change careers. You can't unhave kids. So it really is something that kind of makes you come into three-dimensional time and space. However, if you do have some of that eternal girl aspect to you, motherhood can be incredibly painful because it's always kind of tugging against your desire to kind of go off and just be totally free and unencumbered. And you can have real places where you want to get away. You want to just leave. You want to just leave your kids. And some women have. Yeah. But I would say, that if you did have the situation that you're referring to where you had kids very young before you knew who you were, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have that eternal girl psychology. You may, raise your kids, and then as they start to get older, you're, nearing midlife. And then actually you're sort of in the common place. I mean, most people have some kind of life reevaluation, let's say around age 40. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you've had your kids earlier, then part of your midlife reevaluation will be, well, gosh, I've got the second half ahead of me. What do I want? And that can be very frightening and disorienting to realize that you don't know what you want. I have known some women who had baby one, baby two, and then as they started to kind of face that, they had another baby and then maybe another baby because it sort of put off having to discover who they were. I'm not saying that's the whole reason, obviously, but there can be a little bit of that because as long as you're really just in the young child stuff, there's things you don't have to look at. But eventually you have to say, okay, the kids are moving off into their own life. Now, what do I want? Who am I? What matters to me? It can be devastating to realize that we're 40 something and there's all kinds of things we wish we had done, but we didn't do for one reason or another. And maybe it feels like time's running out. The good news is that there are very few things that can't happen once you're 40. There's some things that can't happen. You will never be an Olympic figure skater. But there's, but if you always dreamed of being a lawyer or there's some part of you that feels called to be a lawyer, that's not too late. It's, it might be logistically difficult, but it's at least something you could explore, and maybe if you can't be a lawyer, maybe there's some version of that. Maybe you could be a paralegal. Maybe you could be in some other related field. You can go back to graduate school. You can start a business. You can do all kinds of things. So it's terrifying. It's a little bit like suddenly realizing that you're up on a tightrope, but it's good to be terrified every once in a while.
Yeah, all the doors haven't closed. Yeah,
that's right.
They're still there. They're still
that's
there.
Right.
Well, one of the quotes that you have in the book from Carl Jung is, "Nothing exerts a stronger psychic effect upon children than the life which the parents have not lived." I mean, it's a pretty haunting quote. It actually brought up a allow me to tell a short story here? And
Absolutely.
then I'm just trying to get free therapy out of this. So, just give me your analysis at the end. But when one of my daughters turned 11, we were up in the mountains for a 4th of July family get together. And she brought this swimsuit that we had purchased right before we went up. And I could see in her mind, I'm on the bed in this Airbnb, I'm nursing a baby behind her, and she's putting on this swimsuit, and she clearly has this idea as, perfectly tween 11-year-old of what this swimsuit is going to look like on her body. And I'm just watching her, and she puts it on, and I see her just stare back really confused. And then her face just falls. And it was like I watched innocence leave, like she leaves the proverbial garden, the carefree, non-judgmental little girl leaves this critical woman, kind of shame-filled woman enters. And I'm like, can hardly keep it together. She didn't even say anything. And you talk about in this chapter about how especially our daughter's wounds can bring up our own old wounds. And I am like, this is about her, but it is also not, it is about something bigger here. And I was able to, she did start to cry. I hug her, tell her she's beautiful. She goes out, the day goes on, but this has clearly still has stayed with me. And I guess my question is, one, is that what you're talking about? And two, when these old wounds that are just bound to come up at very inopportune times when maybe, I think if I have any guilt there, it's like, well, I wish I could have been a little more fully present for her in that moment rather than in my own old wounds. But how what is the best way to kind of to navigate those old wounds without them, without becoming a narcissistic parent where then it just becomes about our old wounds?
Well, it's hard, right? Because the first thing I want to say is like, whose wounds are they? And it's really hard, I think, especially with mothers and daughters. It's sometimes hard to say where one begins and the other ends. And there's, my joke is I've just decided, like therapists call that enmeshment. And I always say, I've just decided the normal thing is for mothers and daughters to be enmeshed. Like that's just normal. But really there is such an entangling of the psyches, I think, especially of mothers and daughters. Some people, again, might disagree with me. This is just my observation. That sometimes she's feeling what we're feeling. Sometimes she's experiencing actually this kind of ancestral wounding. Sometimes she's having her own experience and we're projecting our experience onto her and we don't even realize it. And sometimes we're feeling what she's feeling. And which is it? It's a little kaleidoscopic. At any moment, it might be one of those things, and 5 minutes later, it might be another one. So I think it's, and especially, she's still pretty young at 11. I think, one of my tasks, which continues, by the way, is to try very hard to kind of help that psychic disentangling take place, and that's a delicate thing, but it's literally like, let me just see if I can, remove the tentacles of my psyche that are like stuck to her psyche, I think it's hard. Has any one of us totally like cut all of our psychic bonds with our mother? Like, probably not. So, in terms of like the unlived life, though, I think in a way that's a little different than an old wound. And I do think these old wounds rattle through, and they can rattle through the generations. There can be a way that I'm carrying a wound that my mother had, that her mother had, that my daughter now experiences. And again, is it mine? Is it ours? Is it just, where does it live? Where does it exist? All I can try to do is get more conscious of it, and that may help her. The unlived life is interesting because it means this part of yourself that you haven't acknowledged, that you're not aware of, that you haven't lived out, that you've repressed. And then it kind of lands in this unconscious way on your child. So, I mean, I think a really like super obvious example, this is not subtle, but it maybe gives you a sense. I talk in the book a little bit about the movie Black Swan. But if you remember that movie, and now I cannot remember Natalie Portman's mom, wanted to be this dancer. And she's now completely invested in her daughter being a dancer and doing what she didn't get to do. So she had to stop dancing because she got pregnant with her daughter. And now all she wants is for her daughter to become the dancer. Now that's almost a kind of cliche, but it gives you a sense of like the thing that you didn't do, or that you didn't let yourself know you wanted to do. How has that kind of landed on your kid in some way that may not be very obvious, like that one.
Yeah.
But we all kind of leave our kids with psychological work that we didn't do, that they're going to wind up having to do for us.
Do you think that a big part of that work then is just the awareness of it? I mean, obviously there's more that you can do, but recognizing, I have this with, some of my kids academically with different things in areas where I was weak, easy to want to push in those areas, to have more fears, and just coming back to like, oh, this is my stuff. And they're their own people. And also I was fine. They're going to be fine. I mean, is that so even though, math wasn't my subject, is that much of the work is
I think
the entanglement?
In general, the answer is consciousness. So the more that you can be conscious of, when your kid brings home a bad math score, that your reaction to it probably has a couple different layers in it. And, it may be objective. We all want our kids to, excel and do well. And it's, good to be good at math. But then there's this other personal piece where you have a wound around that. And you may be kind of putting that on your kids a little bit. Or, maybe it's going back to, the way that you felt inadequate, and now you're feeling inadequate again. It's happening again, whatever it is, there's layers, and some of it is just yours. And, it's not that you're probably not going to be able to completely keep yourself from putting it on your kids. Don't be too hard on yourself. The goal here is not perfection, but consciousness certainly helps.
Love that phrasing. One part of the book that I found special solace in lately as my kids have gotten older is about, in the chapter Losing Ourselves, where you talk about periods of disconnection, and especially with our teenagers, that can happen more frequently, maybe for longer periods of time. Now, I should say that you say the disconnection is helpful, and that some amount of it is helpful for them to be able to begin to separate from us, begin to become adults, individuated adults. How do we know if that disconnection is too significant? And of course, we want to know how to minimize that. We're going to get plenty of it without trying. So,
I mean, it's so individual, and it depends so much on the kid. And I think in our relationship with the kid, I think in a way we have a gut feeling, or at least I feel like I did, about whether or not, okay, this is normal, this kid just needs to separate, versus this feels like a more problematic withdrawal from me, from the family. My son was he had a really bad case of mommyitis as a kid. He was absolutely couldn't leave my side. Very, very, very attached. And then when he became a teenager, he was like, talk to the hand. I used to pick him up from school things, and he'd walk toward the car. And as he got close to the car, I'd lock down the door and roll down the window. I'd lock the door and roll down the window this much. And I'd say, you have to tell me what happened before you get in the car. Because otherwise he'd just say, fine. We went through 8 years of everything was fine. he was going to give no information. And he would, by the way, he would laugh when I would do that. It was a joke.
Yeah.
But maybe that's part of it. Maybe it's because we could joke about how we could joke about the fact that he wasn't going to tell me anything. It was a little bit of a family joke, and to the point where, now we were off somewhere visiting some family members, and they have teenage sons, and the mom, my sister-in-law said, "Oh, how was something?" And her teenage son said, "Fine." And my son and I just looked at each other and laughed, because he remembers. But I also knew, like, even though it was a little joke and I kind of poked him a little bit, I knew, like, I really felt like he has to do this. He was so attached to me. He needs to unattach. And like I said, it took a while. I mean, I do think it was something, maybe not quite 8 years, maybe like 6 or 7. It was a long time. But then he kind of came back, and he gets to come back on his own terms, right? I don't decide what he tells me, but now he's calling me up and saying, "Hey, Mom, let me tell you what happened." So, there was just a kind of feeling of trust that I just kind of need to let him go, and that this is kind of the way it should be. And it's, I don't know, it can be so disorienting when that happens, especially if we're so used to being close, but it is meant to happen. They have to separate, go off, and then like renegotiate kind of an adult relationship with us.
That's what I was going to ask you, is how did that, was that emotional for you? Did that bring on its own kind of grief for you? I mean, what a contrast from this early, intensely attached period to a long period of disconnection.
I think that there were definitely times that I can remember specific times that I was like, teary. But in general, it was okay. And I think it was partly okay because this is just me, right? But when they were little, I was so aware of because I was a little bit older when I had kids. I was in my kind of latter half of my 30s. And I was so aware of how precious the time was that I was thinking all the time, I've just got to soak this up. I've just got to, and of course, like, I mean, I think I talk about this in the book. Like, I'd be like, "Oh my God, this is the most amazing thing. I just want to soak it up." And 5 minutes later, I would be like, "Oh my God, I want to bury them in the backyard," and which is so weird.
Save me.
But right. It's like, how long before they go to bed, But I think I just tried to enjoy it as much as I possibly could, so that when it was time for them to move on, in a way I felt ready. And I'm not saying there weren't moments of terrible grief and sadness, but it didn't feel unresolved.
Yeah. Okay. So you go into a little further into the book on encountering darkness. And this was the hardest chapter for me. Because, I mean, you say basically that motherhood forces us to encounter the darkest parts of ourselves, the things that we don't like the most. You say all parents at one time or another see the most despised parts of themselves carried by their children. But if we will stay in relationship with them, then basically we can accept those things in ourselves and our children. What do you think that I really related to this part, but I keep thinking about that phrase, stay in relationship with them. What does that look like in a period of that kind of darkness that's manifested in our kids?
Well, I mean, if we just take your little example and maybe we can push it a little bit further just for an illustration, is you see your kids not being very good at math. And, maybe that's not a big thing, but let's say it is. Let's say that, that's terribly frightening and wounding, and, and you're seeing you are not good at math, and here your kids are not good at math. And maybe you've always felt very ashamed. Like I said, I'm pushing it for illustration purposes, but you've always felt very ashamed of that. It's a real wound, that, your math wound. And here your kids are, they're doing the same thing. And that can bring up such a complicated kind of set of feelings, because a lot of what it maybe brings up is like hatred, like, ew, you're bad at math,
Disgust.
disgust, right? Because you're feeling disgusted at yourself. But it really challenges, and I think this is what I'm talking about, sort of staying in relationship. And you can be like, oh God, I just can't even look at this. It just grosses me out. I hate them. I hate myself. If you can just be like, okay, but I have to kind of show up here for my kid and just be like, all right, let me take a deep breath and look at this. Okay, so my kid's not good at math, and do kind of what you did a minute ago. It's like, well, I turned out okay. Being bad at math is not the worst thing in the world. Let me see if I can pull myself out of this just a little bit and just look at their situation. Look, they have this weakness. They're not good at math, but look, they have this strength and that strength that I never even got close to. Look, they're so good at that, and then maybe we begin to sort of accept our child as this imperfect child who's not good at math. And maybe if we keep doing that long enough, we find a little bit more compassion with ourselves, because, for the inner seventh grader who's failing geometry or whatever.
Yeah. I love that.
It can be a way of visiting an old wound.
Rereading this section in preparation for this interview, it actually brought up for me with my own children, what I seem to be most triggered by is when they're doing something that is whether it's in public or just at home, that's rude. And which seems like, well, that's just like every parent is triggered by their kids being rude. But really, as I read this section, it really hit me that my husband's family is always perceived as very, very nice. And they are genuinely very kind, very good people. My family also very good people. Not as, we're a little more blunt. We're a little more, and growing up, I was definitely perceived by some in my family as more rude, as ruder.
There you go.
And I found this as, reading this section, I was like, when they're rude, I actually feel kind of threatened by it. Like, we can't let those quiz genes hit too strongly because we might be rude. But the cost I think is that I ask them to not be their authentic selves in those moments. And I prioritize this kind of artificial politeness over them being their authentic selves and learning an authentic way how to integrate compassion and kindness in a true kindness versus an artificial. I mean, ironically, sometimes I've been like, why are they acting fake with that person? like they're not really, I don't think they're thinking about, like, oh, I asked them to be that. Anyway, that was pretty revealing for me of some of my own kind of darkness there. And then been interesting actually reading Vital Spark, your other book, of reclaiming a little bit of that energy for myself, from like, oh, I need to do more work there.
There is like a connection there, because that, because the rude Elle, that's shadow material, right? What Jung called shadow. This is the thing you're not supposed to be. But you have it in you. It's there a little bit, and it surfaces sometimes, and there it is in your kids. And it's like, it's like nails on a chalkboard. You have this big reaction to it.
Oh, yeah.
But really, you can probably see how sometimes with your kids, how it's kind of a strength. It's a strength to be able to just say what you mean, and that may help you in the work that you need to do about just, the extent that you need to reclaim that. It's like, you need to learn to be rude, or you need to learn to be a bitch. But whatever wisdom is in the rudeness, because there probably is some, is kind of there to waiting to be harvested.
I mean, it's already so many things have come to me. Like, no, I actually really like that about myself. I'm glad I explored and have taken on other qualities as well. And I've learned from my husband's family and my husband. Like, I really appreciate the way that they use some of these other qualities, and I've been able to integrate those. But it has brought up kind of it's time to revisit some of that and reincorporate some of that fierceness in me that is is actually a strength, but when fully integrated. So that was
and when you can
interesting.
access it choicefully, right? Not when you
That's
just
the key.
going off on people for no reason, but like, boy, now would be a good time to really let some of my bluntness fly. I mean, you're a businesswoman, so I'm sure there are times when that's been helpful.
Had to revisit that a few times for sure. Well, I think for the last question I'd love to ask you is, it's a perfect segue into rage. Let's end on a happy note and talk a little bit about how rage, it's just not something we talk about a lot in motherhood. There's a lot of shame around it. And yet everyone experiences this emotion. So it's silly to act like we don't, right? But how do you see it as a useful trait, and how to use that really for our growth?
Yeah, I mean, this in some ways, this is kind of where I started writing the book. There's this great Faye Weldon quote that's an epigraph on the chapter, and it says something like, the best part about not having children is that you can go on thinking of yourself as a nice person.
I laughed out loud.
Oh my God, that was so true for me. I mean, I didn't know that I was capable of that degree of rage. I really didn't know. And it's so upsetting to get so angry at these little people who are so vulnerable, who, love you and you love them. And, Elle, I wish that I could say, I mean, I feel like I worked on my anger when I was parenting. I feel like I worked and worked and worked. One thing I will say is I never stopped trying. But you know what? I never figured it out. I didn't. I didn't figure out how, I tried breathing and counting till 10. I tried actually a lot of different things. And, one or two things worked a little better than others, but I still yelled, and I'm not proud of that. And it's not like I'm here to tell you that, gee, it's okay to be angry at your kids. And there is so much shame. And, I've worked with mothers in my practice, and they can feel a lot of shame about it. But I think I started writing on this topic thinking to myself, look, no one's going to say that this is good to yell at your kids, to be that angry at your kids. But it probably can't be as bad as we fear it is, because it happens all the time. So how can we understand it? What's going on? And a couple of the things I landed on is that I don't think it's authentic to not get angry at your kids. There's some, anger is very authentic. It's very authentic. You're not faking it when you're angry. People know exactly how you feel. And there's something about that. And there's something about our kids kind of, meeting our kids like that, especially when they're being obnoxious and they're doing something obnoxious. Like, it would be weird if we were just like, I mean, I think I have some thoughts about the gentle parenting movement. I don't know that much about it, so I should probably not really share it. But I think there's something odd about a kid being really provocative and the parent being super, super calm.
It's lying on some level.
Yeah,
right?
It's lying on some level. And then it's like, did you, because like one of the things with kids being provocative, like they want to know they're having an impact on us. And if we act like it's not impacting us, it's like, it's confusing.
Yeah.
So I think there's something about modeling like that anger is okay, that we can get angry at each other, but we're not going to hurt each other. And that we can make a repair. If we said something that we wish we hadn't said, we can go back and say, I'm really sorry. And there's something that's really powerful about a repair. I think that in some ways that's the thing that creates the bond, is the rupture and the repair. It's not about being perfect. It's about being willing to make a repair.
Do you have tips on how to make a repair?
I think just being really honest and authentic and saying, I'm sorry. And you can say, I really don't want to do that again. And I'm going to try not to do that again. I wouldn't promise you're not going to do it again, because it's a promise you might not be able to keep. I think it can be helpful to say, it depends on the age of the child. But in general, when I have a rupture with someone who's an adult, I will try to offer my reflections about how I understand what happened. not as an excuse, but just to show like I took this seriously. I wanted to understand like what was happening with me that I didn't call you for 6 months when you were sick. What was I doing? What happened for me internally? Where did I go unconscious? And let me reflect on that and then offer that along with an apology. Again, not as like, well, here's my excuse for why I didn't call you, but just, and I think another thing about making a repair is not to be like, to let the defensiveness go. And just a lot of times when we've really hurt someone, really, we just want to cry because we feel so bad. And sometimes we defend against that feeling, but it's okay to feel bad if you've hurt someone. It's okay to feel badly if you've hurt a kid. I'm not in favor of mothers self-flagellating, but if you feel sad that you hurt your kid, I think it's, not that you should, put it on them to make you feel better, but just to let them know, I feel really, to let yourself know you feel really bad. Yeah. First of all, that's the most important thing. But, to maybe even share a little bit of that with your kid too, again, depending on the age and that kind of thing. But I mean, really, a repair can just be a very heartfelt, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have done that. I wish I hadn't done that. I shouldn't have done that. I was really tired. Mommy was really tired. It's not an excuse, but, I'm going to try I'm going to try to do better next time.
I love that. Well, do you have any, I guess the very last question is there anything in writing this book that you really want to make sure that a message is communicated to the women reading this book?
I think ultimately this book is an invitation to accept yourself and meet yourself wherever you are, and to know that wherever you are, it's okay, because there can be a lot of self-judgment with motherhood.
Well, I really appreciate the time you've taken to be here with us today. I know that so many mothers will benefit from this conversation, so appreciate you and the work that you do. Thank you so much, Lisa.
Thank you.
Is there anywhere that we can find you, that listeners can find you, and any upcoming projects you'd like to share?
Sure, yes. So my podcast is This Jungian Life, and you can listen to us wherever you get your podcasts. Our website's thisjungianlife.com. My website is lisamarchiano.com, and there's a couple things over there that might be interesting. First of all, I have an online women's fairy tale group. And we look at a different fairy tale every month, and there are prompts, and there's a monthly live, and it's just a really lovely community. It's $15 a month, so it's a nice way to just dip your toe in the water if you want to experience more fairy tales.
I just have to say, the fairy tales are so fun. I think sometimes as adults we can be hesitant to jump into Rumpelstiltskin or some of these old myths. They are absolutely captivating. I will never look at these stories the same again. I mean, truly, it adds such a new level of depth, understanding the symbol. I mean, you can just reread them over and over and get
yes, you can.
Really new treasures. So I have had so much fun with that in your writings.
And they're so beautiful, and they're so full of wisdom. So actually, the fairy tale group is called spinningstraw.com. So Amazing. There's the Rumpelstiltskin reference. So yeah, you can check that out. Links. You can read about it more on my website, or you can go to spinningstraw.com. And I think you can sign up for a free month. And then I have a women's fairy tale and yoga and dream retreat in Italy coming up in August. And we have a few spots still available for that. Oh my God. It's going to be so great.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for being here today, Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and good luck with this channel.
Thank you.